All right, guys, it's Kevin again, and welcome to video number 4. We're talking about the 10 signs of the progressive church, and we are at the historicity of the resurrection. This is a pretty important one, and I'm going to be very brief with this one as well. I just kind of give you the bullet points here. We're talking about the resurrection. Was it a historical event? Did it really happen? We as conservative Christians believe that it did. We believe that this is something that actually literally happened, that Jesus really rose from the dead. He really defeated the grave, and that was one of the greatest miracles that he did do, and we think that is core to our faith, that it really happened. But the progressive church doesn't see it that way. They see that the resurrection is not something to be taken as a historical fact, but it's actually something to be taken a little bit less serious. And so let's talk about their beliefs here. So first of all, most progressive Christians would say that the resurrection either did not happen, or if it did happen, it's very unlikely. So most of them will say, they'll kind of hedge their bets and say it probably didn't happen, didn't literally happen. You will have some progressive Christians who are more open to the idea that this is the one miracle that Jesus was able to do. But most of them would say it probably did not happen. However, they don't completely dismiss it. They don't want to edit it out of the Bibles. They don't want to do anything like that, because they think that there's still a teachable moment. There's still a teachable lesson from the resurrection. And so it's still something, even though if it didn't happen, we talked about this earlier with miracles, even though the miracle didn't literally happen in a scientific way that you could prove or anything like that, that the resurrection still had some type of merit. It still had some type of value. The resurrection as an abstract, as a metaphor, is still as real to them as they would say that a real resurrection is real to us. And a problem that we have with this is that progressive Christians believe that essentially, so they believe the Gospels, they believe the words of Jesus, all the way up until you get to the last couple chapters of each Gospel. So the end of Matthew, the end of Mark, the end of Luke, and the end of John, where it talks about the resurrection. And it's usually like the last 2 or 3 chapters of each of those Gospels. They feel that those last chapters were kind of added onto the Gospel later. And so that the majority of the important stuff about the Gospel is the ministry of Jesus. And they'd say, well, look, that's why the Gospel is, 90% of it is Jesus' teaching and Jesus' ministry, and only just the last couple pages are the resurrection. So they would say that the ministry is a lot more important, and they feel that the last part of that, after he died, after he was crucified, that the disciples and the women kind of all got together, and they just kind of come up with these little stories, these metaphorical hymns of praise, just to show that Christ is bigger than all of this. And so they would say that the resurrection story is more of a metaphor. It's more of like a way to just praise God with this story, than rather something to be taken that actually factually happened. Another thing is the crucifixion, according to progressives, it was something that was not planned. The crucifixion was not something that the Father wanted to do. It's not something that Jesus, when he was born, he didn't know he was going to be crucified. It was not a part of his ministry. It was really just a part. It was more like an accident, and it was that Jesus was teaching the people of Jerusalem, and he was doing his ministry, but then people kind of like attacked him in a mob type of way. And they attacked him, and they took him to this little fake little courtroom where it was all set up, and he was going to be guilty because of the mob, and it's this big old setup really to get Jesus to go away, because they didn't like him. And Jesus didn't really fight it though. Like he used this as an opportunity, not to die on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins, but to die and as a victim, to show that he was still going to be forgiving to people. He was still going to be loving, and he was still going to be, better than the people who were attacking him. And so the crucifixion was not something that was laid out, or not something that he had planned. It's something that just kind of happened, and he made lemonade out of lemon, and he just used it as an opportunity to show how to be forgiving to people who hate you. And so it's not something that the Father or Jesus really had anticipated happening. And so that Jesus became a martyr for what he believed. And so really you see this in religions all across the world. One of the fastest way to grow a religion is to for someone to die for what they believe in. And so that kind of, if you look at Mormonism, for example, that happened with Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was a crazy person who had a lot of crazy beliefs in the Mormon faith, but he did die in a shootout, and you can read that story on your own. But when he died, and he essentially would not back down from the local authorities over something not even related to Mormonism, but he died, and that automatically made him a martyr. And when you die, you start in a religion and you die in the name of that religion, you automatically get like bonus points. And so people follow martyrs. You see that in the faith of Islam as well. When people die for what they believe in, that's a good way to get followers. And Jesus was a martyr. They would say that he martyred. He died for what he believed in. He died for his ministry. He died for this idea of forgiving people. And it was nothing to do. The crucifixion to the progressive church has nothing to do with redemption. Has nothing to do with the atonement. Has nothing to do with salvation. None of that stuff. It's all about just dying for what you believe in. He was a martyr. It was not planned. And so the resurrection really isn't that important because Jesus' main, I don't want to say miracle, but his main exclamation point on his ministry was that he died for what he believed in. And even when he was being crucified, he wasn't violent against people who hated him. He wasn't hateful. He was forgiving. And so that was like the main thing that Jesus did, is he died for his belief. The resurrection is just really not that important to a progressive Christian. And so they say if it didn't literally happen, if it didn't scientifically, really historically happen, then it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. It's not that important to the story. Now, let's talk about, another thing. Being raised was a spiritual thing. And so when a progressive Christian says that Jesus was raised from the dead, they don't necessarily believe that he was raised in a physical sense, that he didn't get a new body necessarily, but he was raised in a spiritual sense. And so they'll look at other miracles in the New Testament where people were raised, like Jesus raised Lazarus and Jesus raised Jairus' daughter. They were raised from the dead, and it wasn't necessarily like a literal thing. It was a spiritual thing, but being raised is something that we can do as well. We can be raised. I mean, it just goes from low to high, essentially what's going on. Jesus was low, and then he got raised up. And so that was kind of a spiritual, metaphorical sense, not necessarily literal or historical. But did the resurrection really happen? That's important to us. We believe that the resurrection did really happen. And what evidence do we have? Let me just give you a few. We've talked about these so many times in our class, so I just want to be brief with them. But we believe that the resurrection did happen. There's a lot of different ways we can look at that. Number one, I think to my opinion, is the most important way to kind of prove the resurrection, at least probably happened. And that's the apostles' martyrdom. The apostles really had everything to lose when Christianity started. They were being, persecuted for their faith. They were being tortured, being put in prison, being killed in some cases. It was not a good time to be an apostle for the Christian faith, because Rome really thought that Christians was their faith was like a threat to the power of the emperor. And so the apostles, when they're out, they're trying to spread the gospel. They're trying to spread Christianity. They're in danger. Their lives are in danger, and they know that. And they know that they're not going to gain anything from this message. They're only going to get killed. And you can see this picture of Peter where he was crucified upside down, but all of the apostles really were martyred for their death. They were killed in very painful deaths. All of them except for John. John was exiled to the island of Patmos, but all the other ones, they were executed for what they believed. And if they knew that Jesus Christ did not die, then there was a waste of energy for them to go out into the world and say that Jesus rose from the dead. If they believed that he did not rise from the dead, then why would they go out and tell people that he did rise from the dead? That would really not make any sense to them, because if they knew it was a lie, why would they go out and die for a lie? A lot of people die for lies, but they don't die for lies that they know are lies. And so that makes no logical sense. If it was actually a lie, if they did get rid of the body, if they did have some kind of conspiracy, at least one of them would have backed out and said, no, I'm not dying for this lie. I'm not going to do that. All of the apostles breathed their last breath proclaiming that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. They witnessed him, they saw his resurrected body, and they were willing to die for that. And I think that's a really good testimony to the resurrection. Also, the first witnesses, if we've talked about this several weeks ago on Easter Sunday, the first witnesses were women. And you may think that's not a big deal, but back then the women's testimony was not very valued. I mean, women's testimony was not always like accepted in court and stuff like that. You always wanted to have men to be the ones who saw something and give their testimony. And so in the Gospels, we see that the women were the first ones to see Jesus had risen from the dead. And so that reads more like a history book rather than some kind of legend. Because if you were going to have like kind of this fake fairy tale legend, you would make sure that the men were the first ones to see him, and they were the ones that were giving their expert testimony. But no, that's not what happened. The women were the first ones to see it, even if that's not very convenient to the culture or convenient to how people viewed women. They were just writing down, this is what happened. Jesus appeared to the women first, and so they were the first witnesses. Skeptics turn into believers. So if you look at Paul, for example, Paul was a Pharisee. He was against Jesus. He was against the Christian movement. He was persecuting them, putting them in jail. And he was the last person on earth that would become a Christian. But when he had evidence that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, he met him on the road to Damascus. Paul became a believer. And I really don't believe that if the whole Jesus resurrection was a fake, if it was a lie, a conspiracy, that Paul would have ever converted. He needed solid proof. He was a smart guy. He was not going to change his entire life based on a lie. He needed concrete proof, and meeting Jesus face to face on the road to Damascus is what turned him into a believer. Not only Paul, though, James, the brother of Jesus, when Jesus was doing his earthly ministry, James, his brother, or technically his half-brother, James didn't believe him. And I bet a lot of people can relate to that you wouldn't believe your other brother. If your brother said that they're the son of God, your first response is like, yeah, right. I saw him grow up. I know him. He's not the son of God. He's just my brother. James was like that. James was a doubter. He didn't believe that Jesus was the Christ until after the resurrection. And it says, Paul tells us that Jesus purposely went out and visited James after the resurrection. He met all the women, he met the disciples, but then he purposely went to see James, his brother, one-on-one, and James became a believer. He believed that his brother was the Son of God, and James went on to be the leader of the Christian church in Jerusalem. And so this is a big shift for James as well. These are skeptics who were against Jesus, and they became believers after the resurrection. Now, the local resurrection, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the resurrection happened in Jerusalem, and that's where the faith of Christianity started. And you don't typically have miracles that are fakes happen and spread and start a new religion in the same city. And so it was open for investigation. Everyone in Jerusalem could just go to the tomb and see if there was a body there. If he really didn't resurrect, then people in Jerusalem could talk to each other like, hey, did you see him? Did you see him? Do you have any proof? Show me where the grave is at. It's in the same city. Jesus rising from the dead in the same city where the religion started really just shows you how believable it was and how true it was and how people could just investigate it for themselves and talk to people who witnessed it and see that it actually really happened. There are also very early accounts. If we go to 1 Corinthians 15, I find this just so fascinating. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 5. This is one of the oldest verses in the entire New Testament. And we talked about it before, but go to that passage and look it up. It's just a great creed that Paul is quoting to the Corinthian church. It's something that he received very early on, right after he got saved. Remember, he got blinded at the road to Damascus, and he became a believer, and then he kind of went away for a couple years, and he started ministering after that. But this is one of the very first things that he received, that Jesus Christ died, was buried, and rose again. And this creed in 1 Corinthians is one of the oldest verses in the entire New Testament. It's not something that, the resurrection is not something that happened hundreds of years later. It was just kind of added. It was something that happened very early on in the start of the church, because they knew it was real. They knew that Jesus had risen, and they were before they even had a scripture, before they had the Bible or Gospels or the epistles, they were already quoting these creeds in the churches that Jesus had risen from the dead. And Acts 4 is also pretty cool as well. This is Peter's sermon again, very early, right after the resurrection, and Peter is preaching to the people, and he says that Jesus is risen from the dead. I mean, very early on in the early church. And so we have all of these early accounts. But guys, these are just 5 ways that we can defend the resurrection. We believe that it actually historically happened. It's something that's core to our faith. The progressive Christian church says, no, it didn't really happen, and it's not really that important, and it's all metaphorical, and it doesn't matter if he rose again from the dead or not. So that's the difference between a conservative church and a progressive church. But that's all I got for this video. So we'll continue on with video 5 next week. And so whenever you're ready, we'll go into that next lesson. But I hope that you're enjoying the study of progressive Christians, and I'll see you again at the next video. Thanks, guys.